After being reborn, the first actions I took were visiting the hospital to terminate the pregnancy I was carrying, and then requesting a divorce from Jason. I didn't seek custody of my son Ethan, nor did I pursue any other assets. My only request was for a house with a sea view in a quaint coastal village. The cozy 3-bedroom home featuring a single living room was warmly decorated by me. All the appliances I purchased were designed for both parent and child use. Initially, Ethan believed everything was set up for him and dismissed the arrangements. It wasn't until he discovered that the pink children's room was filled with dolls and the closet housed numerous beautiful princess dresses that he began to panic. Both he and Jason thought I was mentally unstable and irrational. Ethan broke down crying and saying, "Mom, I'm your biological son. Why don't you even acknowledge me but treat your imaginary daughter so well?" He was unaware that Sophie wasn't imaginary. She was a beautiful, well-behaved daughter who existed in the memories of my previous life. 6 months after moving to the seaside town, I received a call from Jason asking me why. Our divorce had been straightforward, almost as simple as sharing a meal together. We both agreed that Ethan would remain with the Gu family without contesting the custody arrangement. Jason never questioned my sudden decision to end the marriage and handled the process with indifference. I assumed he was indifferent, just as he had never shown concern for the joys and sorrows of my wife. After years of marriage, half a year into our separation, he suddenly inquired why. At that moment, I was hanging a portrait in the freshly painted pink children's room. The painting depicted a woman holding a little girl, seated by a bay window with the blue sea and windmills outside. Golden sunlight illuminated the girl's face, masking her pale complexion. I stared at the little girl's face in the artwork, contemplating why I wanted to explain. Because we were going to have a daughter named Sophie. She was beautiful and well-behaved, but unfortunately, she was unwell. While 70% of congenital heart defects are detected during pregnancy screenings, Sophie was part of the unlucky 30%. You had a fleeting fatherly affection for her, but soon grew weary of her frequent hospital visits and surgeries. You began staying out all night, using the tense home environment as an excuse when I was exhausted from caring for her. While I waited outside the ICU, praying that the god of death wouldn't claim her, you signed the consent to discontinue her treatment and watched as the doctor removed her oxygen tube. You then began an affair with your mistress, openly bringing Ethan along and letting him joyfully call another woman Mom. I didn't say anything. In the end, I simply asked Jason if he had breakfast with Miss Show that day. A year after settling in the seaside town, I encountered Ethan. At that time, I had just returned from a trip to Xinjiang. Walking home with a canvas bag on my back, I noticed 2 figures, one large and one small, standing in front of the corridor. Instinctively, I stopped and kept my distance. As time passed, I rarely thought about this father and son. They disliked me, and my feelings for them had been worn down by years of disappointment in my past life. I believed that as long as I didn't actively seek them out in this life, our paths would never cross again. It was Ethan who broke the silence first. Although he was only 6, he was precocious and spoke in a childlike voice that could hurt. The school had organized a parent-child trip, and his grandparents mentioned that since I was nearby, they should come visit. This was considered proper behavior for members of the Gu family. I nodded silently, recognizing that he and Jason were truly alike, not just in their refined and prominent eyebrows, but also in their cold gazes when looking at me. In my previous life, when I collapsed at Sophie's funeral and later climbed to the rooftop on the 36th floor, they both looked at me with the same detached eyes. Jason had said, "Elena, stop pretending." And he also told Ethan, "Mom, stop pretending." In reality, Ethan had reached out to me just a month after our divorce. Unaware of my relocation to the seaside town, he called me with disdain, mentioning that after I moved, I had specifically decorated a children's room and replaced all household items with parent-child sets. But he insisted he wouldn't live with me and told me not to bother. I responded that I was McComley. Hearing him cheer on the other end about his Aunt Jo giving him a new game console, clearly my departure hadn't affected his life as much as being with his biological mother. He preferred those games and enjoyed spending time with Vivian, who often took him to play and gifted him consoles. However, the indifference on his face abruptly changed, and his features, resembling Jason's, welled up with tears. In an instant, he gritted his teeth and stubbornly stared at me. This time, I responded with a cold and indifferent gaze. Unable to hold back, he turned to flee before tears fell, but stumbled and fell to the ground with a thud. He remained lying there for a long time, only turning his head to look at me. He had always been like this. Every time I approached him, he would show impatience and speak to me coldly. If I lost focus, he would deliberately fall or pretend to be uncomfortable, making me feel soft-hearted and helpless. But this time, I looked at him with coldness and indifference. He opened his eyes in disbelief, his face a mix of confusion, puzzlement, and sadness, and cried out, "Wow, you are a liar, a big liar. You clearly said you would love me forever and stay with me forever." Jason frowned and accused me. "Elena, even though Ethan is young, he knows everything. You shouldn't be so indifferent to him." He appeared serious, his demeanor as condescending as always. Our relationship had never been that of a couple, but more like that of employees and supervisors. He never took the initiative to communicate with me. At home, it was usually me who had to report every detail of my life to him. On his part, he remained indifferent, only intervening or even scolding me harshly in front of Ethan and the servants without mercy. Whenever he showed even slight displeasure, I would subconsciously reflect on myself, wasting energy trying to figure out what I did wrong and how to improve. Now, seeing his face again only made me feel extremely annoyed. "Have you forgotten what you said during our divorce?" I demanded. He had stated that he hoped I wouldn't disrupt Ethan's life in the future, believing that Ethan, being young, would soon adapt to not having me as his mother. "This is the best for him," he had said, one of the longest conversations he had ever had with me during our entire divorce process. He continued as if it were a given. I had taken his words for granted at the time, believing Ethan was my only child. "Mother and child are connected by heart. He needs you, and you also need him," he added. I interrupted him, saying, "But I don't need him." Jason was stunned. Neither he nor Ethan had ever seen me so rude. He seemed unable to comprehend my resolve when I left a year ago, as if he could never understand that Ethan wasn't my only child. I had once had a daughter, even if only I knew. On the day of my rebirth, I dreamed of Sophie crying. She also called me a liar, saying, "Mom, you promised me you would live well after I left." Her crying distressed me so much that I promised her, "This time, Mom will definitely do it." However, I could only fulfill one of my promises, to her and to Ethan. I used to love Ethan as much as I loved Sophie. He was the child I had worked hard to bring into the world, the flesh and blood that had come from me. I had eagerly awaited his arrival. When he couldn't speak yet, as long as he looked at me and smiled sweetly, I could forget all the difficulties and pains of being Mrs. Gu at that time. I was willing to dedicate everything, even my life, to him, as long as he could grow up happily and healthily. Jason, on the other hand, didn't love me. Our relationship had always been quite ordinary. We were childhood sweethearts who had known each other since we were young and had no suitable partners as we grew older. Our elders had brought us together. During my school years, I felt uneasy because of this simplicity. I had seen firsthand how Jason used to be when he loved someone. Young Jason was much more energetic and cheerful than he is now. Every time I saw him, he seemed to be smiling casually when scolded, smiling with high spirits when he won a basketball game, smiling joyfully when he saw his beloved girl. His peach blossom eyes would curve into a crescent, resembling the warm sun in winter, making people's hearts swell and causing them to fall in love with him. Back then, he would prepare handmade breakfast for his beloved girl early in the morning, regardless of the severe cold or heat. He would release sky lanterns for her, fill the playground with flowers, and loudly express his love in front of everyone, passionate and crazy. The girl was a top student, winning awards in various physics competitions. After skipping grades to study abroad early, Jason continued his pursuit of the true essence of physics. However, as the wedding approached, Jason seemed to grow indifferent to everything around him. I confronted him, asking, "Jason, will we truly be happy?" He assured me, "Yes, love makes me overlook everything else." Despite his seemingly indifferent tone, I comforted myself, believing that people mature and become more composed, and that his way of loving would also settle down, until Vivian entered his life. Vivian was a young and attractive game planner, and I realized that Jason only knew one way to love. He began to smile while replying to WeChat messages, paid attention to lipstick shades he previously ignored, researched women's perfumes, and stayed up late with her testing new games. One night, I became anxious when Jason didn't come home. I discovered he was having breakfast with another woman, carefully peeling eggs for her, a gesture I had never experienced before. At that moment, I convinced myself that even if Jason didn't love me, someone in this family did. At least Ethan did. Little did I know that Ethan didn't love me as deeply as I believed, and this realization would gradually break my heart. On the day we had a falling out due to Jason and Ethan's temperaments, I thought they would never return. Unexpectedly, the next day, Ethan showed up downstairs with a small school bag. This time, he was alone. When the property management contacted me, I was working on a drawing of a little girl in a princess dress, running freely on Ely's beautiful grassland. Without any photos of Sophie, I feared forgetting her appearance over time, so I often drew her from memory, from her infancy to the last 5 years of her life, filling every corner of my home with her images. However, I realized Sophie couldn't remain confined to a hospital bed, so I began traveling occasionally to capture beautiful scenes and incorporate them into my drawings of her. One such drawing was interrupted when I was horseback riding in Xinjiang. I injured my right shoulder, making it difficult to lift my hand, leaving the painting unfinished. A month into intermittent drawing, I decided to ride a horse again, choosing a white horse despite warnings from the young man and the horse team about its bad temper and history of throwing people. I dismissed their concerns, enchanted by the horse's beauty. Halfway through the ride, the horse suddenly became angry, knelt on its front legs, and threw me onto the grass. Everyone was shocked. A little girl's mother came to assist me. The girl gently patted the grass off my face and sweetly asked, "Auntie, are you hurt?" Later, I took many photos of her and her mother. They reminded me of Sophie. In reality, the farthest Sophie had traveled from home in her previous life was to this seaside town. Her health had improved slightly, and I had planned a family vacation. However, Jason claimed he was busy, and Ethan said he had to test Jason's company's new game. Ultimately, only my mother and I went. Those few days were peaceful and beautiful. During the day, I taught the little girl to draw at home, and in the mornings and evenings, we collected shells on the beach. She expressed her desire to live here permanently once she recovered from her illness. After our divorce, I requested only the Seaview house, a home for Sophie and me, excluding Ethan and Jason. I didn't want Ethan to enter this house and provided the property management with Jason's and Vivian's contact information without hesitation. A few minutes later, the property management called again, informing me that when they contacted Jason, Ethan had run into the community and disappeared. I had raised Ethan with great care and wouldn't let him get into trouble. Sighing, I put down my paintbrush and went downstairs to search for him. I scoured the entire community, sweating profusely, until I finally saw him waiting at my door with a smug expression, as if saying, "I knew you wouldn't ignore me." Without responding, I opened the door and let him in. Ethan strutted in like a proud little lion, holding his head high and beginning to patrol his territory. He asked, "Which one is my room? You must have bought me a game console. I'm going to play games in my room." I didn't respond, allowing him to sit in the living room while I waited for Jason to pick him up. Returning to my easel, I focused on finishing the painting. After just a few strokes, a loud noise came from the children's room. Rushing over, I saw the painting above the bed had fallen, the frame shattered, and perfume spilled, obscuring Sophie's face. Ethan stood on the bed, looking at me helplessly. "I don't like this painting. Why did you hang someone else's portrait in my room? Why is she in the painting?" I realized he might simply want to remove the painting, not break it intentionally. Understanding he was still a child who shouldn't lose his temper over something he didn't comprehend, my tone remained stern. "Didn't I ask you to wait for your dad in the living room and not touch things anymore?" Noticing my restrained emotions, his expression showed a hint of fragility. In the past, whenever I broke something, he would always check if I was hurt. I didn't respond. My eyes fell on the bedsheet he had stepped on, and I couldn't help but frown. "You get down first," I said. He remained standing on the bed, staring at me. Mom, who is this girl you drew? Why did you draw so many of her? Why is every painting in the house her? His young face couldn't hide the panic and anxiety. He saw the paintings filling the house. The girls in them had eyebrows and eyes similar to mine. Why do the security guard and the residents here say you don't have a son, only a daughter? I told them I was your son, but they called me a liar. I showed them our photos, but they didn't believe me. This is my room, right? He jumped off the bed and opened the closet as if to prove something, but was stunned by the sight of it filled with princess dresses. Why did you buy so many dresses? Where are my clothes? Why are there no clothes for me? He searched the closet thoroughly and then stared at me with wide eyes, desperately seeking an answer to comfort him. I looked into his eyes, which were gradually filling with tears, and remained silent. His tears fell one by one in the quiet, and suddenly he began crying, uncontrollably, pulling out princess dresses from the closet and throwing them onto the bed. He also knocked over all the dolls from the bay window, trying to assert his place. Why do you put other people's dresses in my closet? I don't like dolls. Why are there so many dolls in my room? I don't like this bed and quilt. This is a bed for girls to sleep on. I don't like pink. Why did you paint my room this color? Why do you hug other girls? Why do you hang paintings with other people in my room? I don't like her. I hate her. I hate her. Unable to bear it any longer, I said, Ethan, get out. This is not your room. There's no place for you here. When Jason came to pick Ethan up, Ethan panicked and told him, Dad, Mom is crazy. She's telling everyone that she only has one daughter. A month later, when Jason and Ethan returned, their demeanor had become cautious. Jason told me, Elena, you're sick. He insisted that I video chat with relatives and friends to have them confirm that the daughter I had drawn, the daughter I told the neighbors I deeply loved, did not exist and was merely a figment of my imagination. They produced the family album and forced me to reminisce with them about the past, but our history was too sparse. The album wasn't full. It contained almost no photos of our family of 3, mostly documenting Ethan's growth, with a few pictures of me and him mixed in. As he grew up, perhaps it was typical for boys to gravitate toward those with more authority in the family who could provide better opportunities. He understood Jason's indifference and alienation toward me and now refused to take photos with me. They held the album, which had almost no pictures of me, recounting every detail of our past to try hard to convince me that I never had a daughter. I sneered, Are you calling me crazy? Jason shook his head. No, Elena, you're just sick. He took out a surgical sheet, held my hand, and even became slightly emotional. Elena, why didn't you tell me we had another child? I looked at him silently, seeing regret appear on his face. As for Vivian, I can explain, he continued. It's not what you think. I only paid more attention to Vivian because I valued her talent, and being nice to her was just a way to win over my subordinates. His tone was gentler than ever before. Elena, I understand that you made a sudden decision to terminate the pregnancy and end our marriage because you misinterpreted the nature of my relationship with Vivian. Later on, you felt remorse and began to believe that you had a daughter, placing the blame on me. I didn't manage the situation properly and failed to notice the growing distance between me and my colleagues, which led to your misunderstanding and sorrow, ultimately causing you to become seriously ill in my past life. We were married for 12 years, and I had never heard Jason speak to me with such humility before. I watched him with curiosity, as if I were meeting him for the first time. In my previous life, when I sensed something was wrong between him and Vivian, he would respond to every question and test I posed with coldness, often asking, Elena, are you unwell? Even 6 months ago, he reached out to ask why, but he never answered my questions. Now, he genuinely believes that I am ill. Suddenly, he began explaining his relationship with Vivian in great detail for the first time. He told me, Elena, you're unwell and need treatment. Let me, Nathan, accompany you and take care of you, okay? I requested that he bring Ethan along. When Jason and Ethan arrived a second time, they brought a psychiatrist with them. At that moment, I had just returned from Mexico a few days earlier. The doctor's last name was Lin. He examined my neck and spoke casually as if we were old friends who had known each other for a long time. What's wrong with your neck? I lifted my hand to show a thin purple mark and replied casually, "I had an accident while paragliding in Cancun a few days ago. It was the last stop of my trip to Mexico." While paragliding over the sea and being towed by a motorboat, the rope suddenly snapped. I was taken by surprise and fell into the ocean from a height of dozens of meters. Although I was wearing a life jacket, the paraglider's rope strangled my neck and got entangled with the seat, preventing me from reaching the surface. I gradually lost strength due to lack of oxygen while struggling and nearly drowned. Fortunately, the motorboat operator jumped into the water in time to save me. Looking back, it still feels exhilarating. Dr. Lin didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he glanced at the painting on the easel where the paint was still wet. Sophie was depicted on the paraglider, smiling as she looked at the blue sky and white clouds. He politely asked if he could see my other paintings. After I agreed, he carefully examined all the artworks in my home and then selected one to inquire about. "Can you explain the creative idea behind this painting?" It was a bird's-eye view of the water's surface, showing Sophie floating with her back to us, smiling, and spreading her arms as if welcoming and trying to embrace something. I had drawn this after returning from bungee jumping on the Gandaki River in Nepal. That day, many tourists were there to bungee jump. Some were nervous, while others were excited, encouraging their companions and the staff. Only I remained calm. The staff joked in English that I didn't seem to be there for fun but rather to commit suicide, so they hesitated to push me. Yet, when they did, they showed no mercy. The wind whipped against my cheeks and eyes as I fell rapidly. The fleeting sensation of weightlessness made me feel as if I had returned to the end of my previous life when I jumped from the 37th floor. My memories and senses from that time were hazy, everything ending in an instant. But this time, the feeling of freedom while falling was so vivid that as I neared the water, I hallucinated Sophie's figure emerging from the water. She smiled and reached out her arms to hug me, but when I tried to embrace her tightly, the image shattered into ripples on the Gandaki River. I didn't respond to Dr. Lin's question. Dr. Lin was very patient, attempting to analyze the reasoning behind my actions. "Elena, when you terminated the pregnancy, it was just an embryo without gender characteristics. Why did you think it was a girl? Could it be that you projected yourself onto it?" I laughed. "Are you suggesting I'm narcissistic?" Dr. Lin shook his head. "You're feeling sorry for yourself. Perhaps you redirected your resentment towards your husband onto the child. After regretting the abortion, you created a girl based on yourself. Similarly, it's not that you don't love Ethan. You love him deeply, but you vented your anger on him, channeling all your love into this imaginary girl. However, this little girl is too dangerous for you. You engage in high-risk activities like paragliding and bungee jumping. This imaginary child is leading you towards self-destruction. If you don't open up and seek treatment, the consequences will be dire. Elena, I want to help you." Jason interjected, "Elena, seek treatment. Let us help and care for you." Ethan also stepped forward, trying to hold my hand. His demeanor was more obedient than ever before. I wondered how his mother could suddenly stop loving him. It turned out it was because I was ill. "Let us help you, Mom." "Can you draw a picture for me too? You've never drawn for me before?" I interrupted him. "I painted it for you. I gave you a portrait as a birthday present last year. When I was young, my grades were only above average, and I couldn't compete academically with Jason, whom I liked. However, I was very talented in art and was admitted to the best art school in China. Unfortunately, my parents always believed that painting wouldn't earn much money and hoped I would marry soon after graduating so they could immigrate to New Zealand with my brother without worrying about me. I compromised because the person they were setting me up with was Jason at that time. I thought I could continue painting after marriage, but I soon became pregnant with Ethan. Household chores and raising him gradually consumed my time. Every time I wanted to paint a good picture, Ethan would start crying, forcing me to put down the brush to soothe him. I eventually abandoned painting until Ethan's 5th birthday, when I decided to pick up the brush again and painted a portrait for him. However, he clearly preferred the game console Vivian gave him, so he just discarded the painting later. I found the painting folded into small squares under his desk, used to pad the table legs. Ethan trembled defensively. I didn't mean to do that. I must have taken the wrong thing." I smiled and exposed him. No, you did it on purpose because that day you dragged your feet and refused to take a shower, so I confiscated your game console. You did this intentionally to retaliate against me. You've always acted this way. Whenever I don't do what you want, you hurt me by destroying my gifts and undermining my kindness. You know I love and care for you, and I'd be upset if you did this. You want to make me sad." Ethan's face paled slightly, and he stammered, unable to speak for a long time. I looked up at Jason and realized that I had already sensed his hidden intention to make peace. For example, in my previous life, Ethan's school never organized parent-child trips. With so many bodyguards and nannies in the Gu family, how could they let Ethan wander alone without being in a hurry? Additionally, whether in the past life or after rebirth, he hadn't worn the clothes I bought for him for a long time. One day he started buying his own clothes, which I later discovered were all purchased by Vivian to please her. He never wore the clothes I bought again, and even switched his perfume to a leather scent that Vivian preferred. Although he visited me a few times, he deliberately wore the clothes I had bought and sprayed my favorite woody perfume, showing indifference. I didn't understand why he suddenly wanted to reconcile after a year, or why he didn't just bring Vivian into our home when I had already made space for her. I kept these thoughts to myself because he was accustomed to being arrogant around me. Even when he sought peace, he couldn't let go of his pride. He only wanted to use Ethan to soften my heart and make me return. Now that he believes I am ill, it seems he has found a way to approach me. His attitude changed dramatically in an instant. He learned to be gentle and accommodating, as if seeing me as fragile and in need of protection because I am a patient. All his actions now had significant and selfless reasons for my well-being, and he behaved so sincerely that I almost believed it. "Jason, you claimed there was nothing between you and Vivian, so why did you invest so much money in acquiring the finest jade? You meticulously hand-carved Buddhist statues and climbed the 9,991 steps of Nanshan Temple with one, kneeling with each step just because she was susceptible to illness. You even asked a monk to consecrate it, something you never did for Sophie when she was gravely ill in your past life. As a father, why did you use overtime as a reason to be with her on Valentine's Day? Why did you embrace and kiss her, even though Jason's appearance was unpleasant, and I smiled? Are you curious how I know all this so well? Your son informed me. The first time I heard about Vivian was through Ethan. Suddenly he started frequently praising Aunt Jo, asking what Aunt Jo did with Dad. Mom, why can't you be as good as Aunt Jo? Initially, it might have been unintentional, but it soon became clear that he was doing it on purpose. I realized he was being deliberately hurtful every time Vivian was mentioned, especially whenever I did something that upset him. I understand he likes Vivian and her activities, but perhaps he doesn't truly want her as his mother. Instead, he enjoys highlighting his father's closeness with other women as a way to punish and confront me, particularly after I had Sophie in my previous life. His behavior escalated over time. During my pregnancy, he would intentionally or unintentionally comment that I was fat and unattractive, unlike Aunt Jo, who was slim and beautiful. While I was breastfeeding, he would casually remark that my belly was loose with many wrinkles, my clothes were shabby with milk stains, and I smelled unpleasantly of milk. It's no surprise Dad had to sleep separately from you. When I was with Sophie in the hospital for surgery, he would repeatedly tell me that Jason was with Vivian that day and would accompany her the next. He'd excitedly share that Vivian was amazing, had designed a new game, and had something fun planned. Unlike me, who seemed useless after returning from a business trip with Jason. He'd inform me that Jason and Vivian went to various places, played games, and others saw them as a family of 3. He'd proudly show me their photos together, asking if they looked good, thinking he was keeping it a secret. Yet, every time he spoke, I could clearly see the malice in his eyes. For the first time, I witnessed the pure cruelty of a child from my own son. He was like a devil, constantly repeating hurtful things in my ears, driving me insane. I knew that many bored relatives and friends might have influenced him, suggesting that if I had another child, I would only love Sophie and not him. I questioned whether I was truly being fair to both him and Sophie, which might have led to his erratic behavior. However, after much reflection, I was certain I wasn't biased. Despite tirelessly shuttling between the hospital and home for Sophie, I would check on Ethan daily, inquire about his well-being, ensure the nanny fed him properly, and help him with his homework for parent-teacher meetings. Unless Sophie needed surgery, I would make sure to be there, even staying up for 48 hours at the hospital without rest. Before Sophie was born, he didn't enjoy my company, often finding me nagging and annoying, preferring to be alone playing games. But when I reduced my time with him to give Sophie the attention he didn't want, he became unhappy again. He could reject it and not appreciate it, but I couldn't offer that to anyone else. I couldn't see who he resembled with his selfish and unpleasant nature. It wasn't until I left Jason without hesitation after my rebirth, but Jason later approached me again seeking peace, that I realized he resembled his father, the man who was busy cheating on me and figuring out how to divorce me. When I was overwhelmed by Sophie's illness and hurt by Ethan's occasional intentional provocations, I didn't want a divorce. I'm neither a masochist nor someone who only believes in love. I couldn't live without Jason. But for Sophie's sake, I couldn't continue. The cost of her treatment was beyond our ordinary income. If I divorced Jason and left Sophie to him, I feared he would prioritize Vivian over spending time at the hospital, and Sophie's heart condition might not withstand the turmoil of family changes. So, I had to endure it. I kept wondering why Jason could love Ethan but not Sophie. Sophie was beautiful and well-behaved, enduring her illness and numerous surgeries with grace, even shedding tears when frightened in the hospital. She always encouraged me to rest more, missed her father and brother, and was confused why they never visited, yet she never asked or complained. At such a young age, she was so perceptive it was distressing. It wasn't until after Sophie passed away that I found the long-prepared divorce papers in his study. I realized that because of Sophie, he couldn't proceed with the divorce. A man who seeks divorce when his daughter is near death, fearing the public backlash and Vivian's reaction, couldn't bear to lose me. Instead, he vented his anger on Sophie. Ethan, witnessing his father's indifference, followed suit. Even though Sophie adored him as a brother, he refused to stay longer in the hospital to support his suffering sister. When I forced him to stay, he would simply sit with his head down playing games, ignoring Sophie when she spoke, and deliberately provoking her when I wasn't around, just as he did with me. On Sophie's 5th birthday, I called Jason, pleading for him to come home so our family of 4 could celebrate. I had prepared a painting for Sophie, one I had created again after my rebirth, and hung in the children's room, but Ethan destroyed it. I held Sophie and sat on the bay window, gazing at the blue sea and windmills outside, as golden sunlight bathed her pale, sickly face. Sophie adored the painting and kept it close, looking at it often, but Jason didn't return until he was about to light the candles on her cake. I saw the disappointment in Sophie's eyes, hid in the kitchen, and called out to Jason, but he didn't answer. When I went back to the living room, trying to figure out how to explain his absence, I heard 11-year-old Ethan looking at the painting with contempt. He maliciously said, "It's so ugly your face is as white as a ghost. In our school, girls as ugly as you are only hated. No wonder your father doesn't want to celebrate your birthday with you." Sophie's face turned pale, and I couldn't believe what I heard. Could Ethan have always spoken harshly to Sophie when I wasn't around? I had never hit Ethan since he was older, but this time I couldn't help but slap him. He touched his cheek, looked at me in shock, and angrily shouted, "Dad went on a date with Aunt Jo. He won't come back to celebrate your birthday with you, the sickly girl. No matter how many times you call, it's useless. In the future, I won't celebrate your birthday anymore. Dad will divorce you and marry Aunt Jo and be with their family of 3. I don't want her sickly girl, or you." Sophie collapsed on the spot, clutching her heart. That day, when I carried her fragile body to the ambulance, I prayed desperately for divine mercy. But after the doctors saved her, they still told me Sophie's condition couldn't handle another operation and advised me to give up. I watched Sophie in agony on the hospital bed, my mind racing and utterly confused. For a while, I desperately called Jason, but he never answered. Later, I discovered he was with Vivian. Ultimately, I signed the consent form to cease treatment, watching the doctors remove Sophie's oxygen tube and turn off all equipment. Jason was the last to arrive at the hospital, followed by his parents and funeral home staff. He hurried over and asked why I didn't wait for him, why I gave up treatment without his permission. I thought, what am I waiting for? To see him leave his lover's bed and come to Sophie's side to pretend to be a loving father so others wouldn't criticize him for not being there when his daughter was dying? For his reputation? Did my Sophie have to suffer a few more hours? I looked at him and then at Ethan, who stood far outside the ward door. The expressions of father and son mirrored each other, complete indifference. One was preoccupied with an affair while his biological daughter was dying, not even celebrating her last birthday with her. The other viciously provoked his own sister to death. How could they remain so calm without shedding a single tear? Suddenly, I felt the true horror of both father and son. I recognized that these events are remnants from my previous existence, occurrences that have not taken place in my current life and will never recur. Perhaps it's unfair to condemn 6-year-old Ethan for a wrongdoing that hasn't manifested in this lifetime. Nonetheless, I find myself with no alternative. Carefully, I loosened my grip from Ethan's hand and directed a smile towards Dr. Lin. "Dr. Lin, you're mistaken," I said. "The little girl depicted in the painting poses no threat to me. However, Jason and Ethan do. If someday I lose my sanity and perish, it must be because of these two individuals who drive me towards madness and death." When Jason and Ethan visited for the 3rd time, their demeanor hardened once more. At that moment, I was getting ready to depart for Iceland. Just as I was about to step into the elevator with my suitcase, Jason emerged from another elevator and halted me. "Elena, if you continue to refuse psychiatric treatment, I will have to compel you to be admitted to a mental hospital," he threatened. I glanced at him with a smirk. "What authority do you have to force my hospitalization? We're divorced, and you're not my guardian." "There's nothing between us, ex-husband," Ethan interjected, "but I can do it. I'm your son." I looked down at him. "It's unfortunate you're not yet an adult. They can't do anything to me." I turned and walked away. Jason reached out to restrain me once more, but ended up breaking the necklace around my neck. The necklace clattered to the floor, and the pendant's cover shattered, revealing a small printed portrait of Sophie. Jason stared intently at the tiny image, his temper finally flaring. "Since you chose to abort the child, there's no reason for you to regret it." I grasped the pendant tightly with trembling hands, refusing to display any vulnerability, and struck him with a backhand slap. "He doesn't understand anything. He knows nothing." Memories from my previous life flashed before me. Sophie lying in the hospital bed, in agony crying out to me, "Mom, I feel so uncomfortable. I'm in so much pain. If there's another life, can't I choose not to come into the world?" I had no other choice. I placed the broken necklace into my pocket, ceased looking at Jason, grabbed my suitcase, and entered the elevator alongside Ethan. Iceland's winter exudes a profound sense of desolation. The relentless waves crash against the black sand beaches, where the dark sand and lava-formed gravel starkly contrast with the white foam of the waves and waterfalls. The landscape is adorned with volcanoes, glaciers, fjords, and numerous unique landforms on its small island, creating breathtaking scenery. Being near the Arctic Circle, winter sunlight here is fleeting, with the sun perpetually skimming the horizon. The morning's rosy hues seamlessly blend into the evening's purples, and the pink and purple auroral bands linger in the sky for extended periods. Upon my arrival at Keflavik Airport, I brought along a collection of high-end photography gear. Renting a car, I planned to explore the island in pursuit of the Aurora Borealis. However, the Aurora KP index was below 1 on clear days, or the weather was too overcast, preventing any photography. On the final day of my trip, the forecast predicted a blizzard for the evening, potentially closing roads for several days. Reluctantly, I decided to cut my trip short, unwilling to abandon my quest for the northern lights despite the KP index remaining at just 1. Observing that the sky was still clear, I chose to venture out at night, hoping for better luck. I located an empty open area in the wilderness and waited in my car until 3 a.m., but nothing materialized. Disheartened, I resolved to give up. Yet, sometimes fate plays unexpected tricks. As I started my car to leave, the aurora suddenly appeared. The green luminescent bands danced across the sky, flickering and shifting in a mesmerizing and enigmatic display. Quickly, I set up my camera equipment and found the best vantage point to capture this natural spectacle. The temperature was over 10 degrees below zero. I stood outside, mesmerized by the aurora, but the cold became unbearable, prompting me to return to the car to rest while the equipment continued to shoot automatically. The necklace that Jason had ripped from me now hung from the rearview mirror, with Sophie's smiling face on the pendant. Gazing at her image, I smiled. Sophie, look, your mom took you to chase the northern lights. I reclined in the car, watching the aurora dance outside the window until exhaustion overcame me, and I fell asleep. Upon waking, it was quite late, and I was already finished. I couldn't determine when a strong wind had begun to blow outside the vehicle. The location where I had set up my photography equipment was somewhat distant from the roadside where I had parked, and the blowing snow had reduced visibility to the point where I couldn't locate the equipment setup. From inside the car, I estimated the time needed to drive back to Keflavik, considering the approaching blizzard predicted for the evening. I exited the car and attempted to retrieve my gear amidst the wind and snow, unaware that the blizzard time indicated by Iceland's weather forecast was not always precise and often delayed. Upon reaching the equipment site, I discovered both tripods had been knocked over and one camera had been swept away by the wind. After a prolonged search through the snow, now several times deeper than the previous night, I finally located the damaged camera. Concerned that melting snow might corrupt the SD cards, I swiftly placed the SD cards from both cameras into my pocket. As I packed up my equipment and began the trek back, the surroundings had turned white, with visibility dropping below 5 meters. The rental car key didn't include a search feature, so I was left to carry 2 heavy cameras and a tripod while feeling my way toward the car. I walked for an extended period, far surpassing the distance from the equipment location to the car, only to realize I was lost in the early onset blizzard. I tried to ascertain my direction, but became utterly exhausted. Ultimately, I had to abandon the bulky camera and tripod, yet I still couldn't locate the car. I retrieved my mobile phone to call for assistance, but discovered there was no signal. Left with no choice, I wandered aimlessly through the howling blizzard alone as the storm intensified. The fierce winds, laden with snow particles, battered me so forcefully that I couldn't keep my eyes open. My pace slowed gradually as my body began to lose heat, and my limbs grew numb and stiff. Understanding that I couldn't afford to stop, I continued to move forward instinctively until I eventually collapsed into the snow. I believed I was about to perish in a foreign snowstorm, but fear eluded me. Instead, a sense of relief washed over me. "I'm sorry, Sophie," I thought. "I don't want to break my promise to you, but I can't hold on any longer." In truth, Dr. Lin was correct. I was indeed ill and had been flirting with death. After Sophie passed away in my previous life, I spiraled into severe depression. I was already unwell. Discovering Jason's infidelity, enduring Ethan's relentless provocations, and accompanying Sophie through daily surgeries and hospitalizations made the world appear bleak and hostile. My husband and son were indifferent, and my daughter was pitiable. Despite my relentless efforts and daily struggles, I couldn't find a way forward or a glimmer of hope. For Sophie's sake, I gritted my teeth and persisted, always masking the fractures within my family and hiding the ugly realities of her father and brother from her until her death. All the repressed negative emotions erupted simultaneously, engulfing me like an abyss. While I vowed to Sophie that I would live well even after her departure, I couldn't control myself and began to harm myself. Initially, Jason and Ethan felt remorseful. They composed themselves, but their indifference to Sophie's death wasn't complete. People often embody contradictions. They strive to evade their wrongdoings while simultaneously feeling guilty and yearning to make amends. They continued to pretend we were a happy family of 3, just as I used to. Jason ceased seeing Vivian, and Ethan no longer uttered those hurtful words, maintaining the facade of a harmonious family. However, this charade didn't hold any weight for me. I constantly recalled their cold gazes by Sophie's bedside. Regardless of their smiles or gentle demeanor, in my eyes, they remained cold-blooded, terrifying, hateful, and utterly repulsive monsters. The closer they drew to me, the worse my condition deteriorated. I couldn't help but cry in the dead of night, lose my temper, and inflict pain upon myself. Eventually, they grew impatient, ashamed of me, and began to view me as a burden. Their interactions regressed. Jason stopped returning home, and Ethan spoke to me with coldness once more. The day I climbed to the rooftop on the 37th floor, Ethan shouted at me in frustration. "Sophie's death is entirely your fault. It has nothing to do with anyone else. There's no genetic disease in our family. If you had not neglected to provide her with a healthy physique, she would not have fallen ill, nor would she have passed away. I found myself standing at the rooftop's brink, utterly astonished. It became clear that the blame lay with me. There must have been an aspect I overlooked during my pregnancy that led Sophie to develop a heart condition. Confronted with the reality of her suffering in this world, the fragile barrier that had restrained me from embracing death snapped at that instant. I leapt from the 37th floor. Even if I were granted another life, those negative emotions would persist from the day of the abortion. I longed to shed all the blood on the operating table and depart alongside Sophie, yet I dreamt of her, hearing her incessant cries and pleas for me not to die. I couldn't bring myself to let her down. That day, upon returning home, I saw Jason and Ethan continuing their reckless lives. They were clueless, unaware of anything. Only I possessed the knowledge of our past lives and bore all the agony. I was the sole one who remembered their wrongdoings and their monstrous appearances, prompting me to flee from those two abominations, Jason and Ethan. However, it wasn't sufficient. The negative emotions lingered, and the pain and guilt remained. I was determined not to break my promise to Wei Wei, so I clung to her memory and relied on my yearning for her to consistently remind myself to uphold my commitment. To battle depression, I set up a nursery for her and acted as if she were still with me. I painted numerous portraits of her, nearly driving myself mad, traveled the world in her honor, and tried to convince myself that everything had changed and was improving. I attempted to release the negative emotions, but I couldn't resist contemplating death repeatedly. Every time I engaged in those high-risk endeavors, I deceived myself into believing that this was something Sophie had been looking forward to. In reality, it was what I had anticipated. Finally, my long-awaited death arrived. I felt a sense of peace amidst the white wind and snow as I slowly closed my eyes. Beep, beep, beep. The relentless sound of car horns echoed through the snowstorm. With visibility reduced to zero, the harsh noises pierced through the wind and snow directly into my ears. They persisted, refusing to relent and causing me irritation. I battled the darkness and negativity within my heart for an extended period amidst the continuous honking. I truly wanted to give up. I desperately wanted to surrender, but thoughts of Sophie emerged. Eventually, I opened my eyes and struggled to rise from the snow. I reached out to the tripod I had previously discarded, only to find it spinning in the same spot. I had used the tripod as a crutch, and now with limbs nearly numb from the cold, I crawled towards the source of the car horns with all my remaining strength. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. When I finally located the car, I realized it wasn't far, at most about 100 meters away. Trembling, I opened the car door and witnessed a magical scene that I can hardly describe. No matter how many times I reflect on it later, I believe it was Sophie's spirit that saved me in the deadly snowstorm and guided me to safety. This couldn't be a coincidence. I don't know if the heavy tripod I had placed on the passenger seat had tilted towards the driver's side due to the blizzard shaking the vehicle, causing the necklace I hung on the rearview mirror to somehow detach and entangle the tripod on the steering wheel, thereby activating the horn. Amidst the constant honking, Sophie smiled at me from the pendant. In that moment, I broke down in tears. After returning to the car that day, the phone signal was restored. I called the rescue number, and half an hour later, rescuers from Iceland arrived and took me to a local hospital for examination. Fortunately, my frostbite was not severe, and I went home after a few days in the hospital. Following that blizzard, my depression seemed to lift suddenly. I had always known that this seaside town was beautiful, but during the year I lived here, I had been numb and unable to feel anything. Even when traveling, I couldn't appreciate any scenic beauty. However, after returning from Iceland, everything here felt different. The large windmills in the distance turned leisurely. The blue sea gently lapped the golden beach, and the sunset over the rusty, broken boat was so stunning that it captivated me. The world no longer appeared gray. It was filled with vibrant colors. I continued to live here, painting and traveling, but I no longer intentionally engage in dangerous activities. I began exploring new media, sharing my paintings of Sophie and some of my travel photography online, which garnered significant attention. Suddenly, I became a recognized painter and photographer with many followers. A year later, someone reached out, offering to help organize an exhibition, and I agreed. The exhibition's theme was, "Angels Have Been Here," and all the displayed paintings were portraits of Sophie. On opening day, there were unexpectedly many attendees, including Jason and Ethan. Although I didn't take it seriously, they actually started harassing me. After seeing that I wouldn't accept psychological treatment, Jason changed his tactics. In both our past lives and this one, during our marriage, he never gave me flowers or surprises. Now he attempted to use this opportunity to entice me into remarrying him, to which I responded with a sneer. As for Ethan, every time he saw me purchasing items for Sophie's home, he became extremely jealous. When I loved him in the past, he seemed to prefer those games more. But now, no matter how many games Vivian gave him, he would simply tell her to leave. Jason had also fired her. Now he appeared to seek my maternal affection more than his previous interests in games. He wept and said to me, "Mom, I am your biological son. Why don't you even acknowledge me but treat your imaginary daughter so well?" Until a week ago, they had suddenly ceased their actions, and I thought they were finally tired, annoyed, and had given up. However, now they were at my exhibition again. Seeing my wary expression, Jason bitterly smiled and said, "You don't have to be like this. We are not here to cause trouble." He gazed at the nearest painting, Sophie in the snowstorm, smiling like an angel, and his eyes began to mist over. "Ethan, I have been having the same dream for some time. I dreamed that we have a daughter named Sophie." Ethan also raised his red-rimmed eyes and asked, "Mom, I dreamed of it too. Is it true?" I looked at them coldly and remained silent. That day, Jason and Ethan examined each painting in the exhibition with teary eyes. The final painting occupied the entire wall, set against the magnificent aurora of Iceland. Sophie had grown white wings and soared into the sky. "She is my angel. She has been here before." Jason and Ethan stood before the painting for a long time and never reappeared in my life again. When Ethan was 11, Elena remarried and soon had a daughter named Sunny. On the day Sunny was born, Ethan climbed to the rooftop on the 37th floor and asked to see Elena. Jason looked at him impatiently and said, "Ethan, stop fooling around." At that moment, both father and son were taken aback. They both recalled that dream and their previous life when Elena was standing on the 37th floor, swaying in the wind. They also remembered telling her to stop messing around as blood splattered after Elena fell that day. Sophie's pallor when she died had haunted Jason's nightmares for many years. Elena's assessment of him was accurate. He was merely a philanderer. He always felt that Elena was too dull, too quiet, and too invisible. She repeated the same things at home daily, dressed similarly, and seemed like a backdrop. It wasn't until after the divorce that Elena left without looking back that he realized his feelings for her. She was like a gentle rain, quietly softening everything and subtly weaving into his entire life without his awareness. Once she abruptly left, it was as if a gaping hole had formed in his heart, one that couldn't be filled. Naturally, he called out her name when he couldn't find anything, and when he turned around, he would have the illusion that she was waiting behind him. One late night, after he had lost his love for her over several days, his yearning for her overwhelmed all his reason like a fierce virus. He wanted to find her again. At that time, he didn't understand anything. He knew nothing. He thought he had concealed the matter with Vivian very well and could pretend that nothing had happened. Elena loved him deeply, and as long as he slightly lowered his guard to show his kindness, she would undoubtedly return without hesitation. He didn't know that Ethan had revealed everything to Elena behind his back. He was unaware of what he had done in his previous life, and didn't understand why Elena looked at him with cold, mocking eyes, as if he were something filthy, until he had that dream. In the dream, after Elena died in the previous life, he also repented, just as he did now, and finally recognized his feelings for Elena. Guilt, heartbreak, longing, and intense emotions nearly drove him insane. He knew he had to act, to do something, so he took revenge on Vivian. He fired her from the company, leaving her with nowhere to go, heavily in debt, and even forcing her to sell her body. Eventually, she contracted a disease and came to him with a knife. As she stabbed him in the heart frantically, she roared, "Did I force you to cheat? Did I force you to sleep with me? It's you! You are a slut! You can't control yourself? Why do you blame everything on me?" Indeed, he is an utterly repulsive individual who prefers to dodge accountability and evade the truth, much like he did when he was aware that Sophie would be born with congenital heart disease. It is highly probable that Elena uncovered his infidelity during her pregnancy, which triggered Sophie's congenital condition. However, he refused to acknowledge this connection. He disregarded both Elena's and Sophie's suffering, turning to extramarital relationships to numb himself. Even on the day Sophie passed away, he was unwilling to accept his mistakes. Instead, he placed the blame on Vivian, accusing her of using her gentle nature to restrain him and for silently setting his phone to silent mode, causing him to miss Elena's calls and Sophie's final birthday. He also held Elena responsible, alleging that she signed the consent form to discontinue treatment without authorization and prematurely ended Sophie's life so that he wouldn't have to see her one last time. He convinced himself that the fault lay entirely with them, denying any wrongdoing on his part by clinging to this distorted reality. Thus, Elena was correct in her assessment. He was truly a monstrous figure, with a hideous visage and no sense of remorse. He deserved his fate, unable to redeem himself in Elena's eyes. Unworthy of her love, he never dared to face her again. In reality, he didn't want to let go of Elena. He actually wished to continue bothering her, but was intimidated by her cold gaze, which mirrored his inner darkness and rendered his filth invisible. Over the years, he had been suppressing himself in Ethan, ensuring that neither he nor Ethan would disturb Elena. In fact, he also blamed Ethan, holding him accountable in his past life for provoking Sophie's death and ultimately forcing Elena to die, despite not guiding Ethan properly or preventing his bad behavior. He deceived himself into believing he was blameless, attributing everything to Ethan, an 11-year-old child in his previous life after Elena's death. Ethan himself endured severe depression after Elena passed away. Elena had noted that Ethan's bad habits closely mirrored his own, which was undeniably true. Just as he didn't know how to repent until Elena's death, Ethan was unaware of the depth of his love for his mother, who had been mentally abused by him until Elena died. After her passing, Ethan would suddenly start crying for no apparent reason, lose his temper without explanation, and engage in self-harm when not monitored. Jason observed all of this with indifference, choosing not to care about him in his past life, and remaining unaware of Ethan's fate after his death. However, after experiencing the same dream about his past life as Ethan in his current life, Ethan struggled with the same intense depression he had before. He constantly cried and yearned to see Elena, often clutching his chest and asking Jason, "Dad, my heart hurts so much. Do I have a heart disease like my sister? If I do, can my mother and sister forgive me?" Yet, every time he visited the hospital for a checkup, the results were normal. As he grew older and understood the psychological impact, he stopped asking Jason these questions but still longed to see Elena. Because Jason was observing him, Ethan could only monitor Elena's life through the internet and others. Upon discovering that Elena had a new boyfriend, he began to provoke Jason in the same manner he did with Elena. He would intentionally inform Jason about Elena's outings with the man, her receiving gifts from him, their kisses, and that she had accepted his proposal. When Elena was getting married, he tirelessly recounted to Jason how happy she was after leaving them. Ethan subjected himself and Jason to punishment and torment. Eventually, Jason comprehended how Elena felt when dealing with Ethan and understood why Elena was so resolute in not wanting a son. He realized he was a vile demon like himself. When Jason learned that Elena was about to marry, he nearly lost his sanity, wanting to rush to her, seize her, and exclaim, "How can you get married? How can you fall in love with someone else? Have you forgotten Sophie?" Yet, he restrained himself. Even without an invitation, he sent an appropriate gift when he learned she was pregnant and had another daughter. Jason was devastated, but no longer felt the same excitement. Instead, Ethan caused a significant commotion. On that day, atop the 37 the floor rooftop, both father and son were stunned by the 3 words Ethan blurted out, "Don't mess around." Ethan then descended the rooftop on his own and never expressed a desire to see Elena again. They reviewed Elena's Weibo together, and a fan inquired why she named her daughter Sunny instead of Sophie after drawing so many Sophies. Elena responded, "Sophie is Sophie, Sunny is Sunny." Others may not understand, but Jason and Ethan know that Sunny is not a replacement for Sophie and isn't meant to fill Sophie's void. Elena is a good mother who never shows favoritism among her children. Later, Jason donated half of his estate to charity and founded a charitable organization dedicated to children's cardiovascular diseases. As Ethan matured, he often recalled the negative aspects from his past life dreams. Although he enjoyed playing games and admired Vivian, who could design games, he never considered making Vivian his mother. Initially, he wanted to use this approach to resist Elena's control over him, but eventually, he grew to hate that most of Elena's attention was devoted to Sophie. He feared that Elena might genuinely stop loving him after having a sister, as people had said in his past life when he was 11 years old. He might not have realized that his actions, which deliberately provoked Elena and Sophie, were wrong, and that he didn't want them to die. However, once negative words became habitual, they continually slipped out, causing him to become very silent. Upon entering university, he chose not to pursue finance, but instead studied medicine, specializing in pediatric cardiovascular disease. He volunteered at children's hospitals during holidays, and both he and Jason sought to atone for their past sins in their own ways. Many years later, Ethan finally became a certified pediatric heart surgeon. He dedicated almost every day to the hospital, either treating patients or performing surgeries, desperately overworking himself as if curing more children could erase the sins in his heart. Eventually, he encountered a 5-year-old girl who was exceptionally beautiful and well-behaved, suffering from the same congenital heart disease as Sophie. Ethan was her surgeon, and on the day of her operation, which coincided with her birthday, the surgery lasted 20 hours and was successful. Exhausted but smiling, Ethan left the operating room, only to collapse as his heart stopped suddenly, departing with a smile. This is the end of the story. Don't forget to subscribe or to become a support member of the channel. Link in the description.